Hey there, bright lights. Welcome back to the Space Doctor series on the Architecting channel. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Angela. I am an architect, feng shui practitioner, and researcher who has devoted my whole career to studying the science behind design for well-being, aka salutogenesis. And you being here is a great opportunity for us to learn together, because if there's one thing I know, it's that the spaces that we inhabit have a huge effect on not only how we feel, but our performance, even our health. It's that big of a deal. Now, I just got back from an incredible 2-week vacation in Australia, where I had a chance to travel all around the country and to learn about modern life, but also the ancient customs and rituals. Australia is a very ancient land. The peoples of Australia have inhabited the continent longer than most other places on Earth, 60 to 70,000 years of continuous culture all in one place. I walked through rainforests that were determined to be part of the megacontinent Gondwana, and fossils of some of the same plants that are found in these rainforests were found in Antarctica, buried under the ice, and are thousands of years old. So it was an incredible experience and a chance to reaffirm something I've always known, but I love seeing it through the eyes of different cultures, which is the sacred nature of space and place. It happened to be my birthday while I was out there, and I spent that day in the outback hiking Kings Canyon, which has many sacred sites, as well as having a chance to visit the Attila Rock Formation and Salt Lake, which is part of a sacred women's site, and Uluru, which is another rock formation that was a sacred men's site. And what made people feel that something in the landscape was sacred? Because we find this all over the world. It's the fact that inherently, whether we know it or not, our body knows that space feels like something. There is a different energy in different geology and different landscape. And people over time, all over the world, have mythologized what it felt like to be in that space. It is how they seek resonance and solace and infuse meaning into their lives. And I will definitely be talking about this more. If you don't know, I do the Architecting podcast, and I did talk specifically about song lines in Australia in the episode that came out a little over a week ago. So you can find that also on the YouTube channel under the podcast if you're interested in hearing that. And I always feel that I'm led to do things because they are going to be that next building block for me. And I'm really excited to say that I have been offered a deal to write a book about this research on salutogenesis that I talked to you about so much on the Space Doctor series. And this year, I just felt called to go to Australia. It just really resonated as a place I wanted to see this year for my vacation. I even put off a much needed bathroom renovation in order to redirect the funds to taking this very big trip, because it felt that important to me. And what I learned about song lines and that place and space was so inspirational, and I'm definitely going to be using that in the book. But let's get started for today. I make thoughtful weekly videos where I use my Saluted Genesis deck, which has two parts: foundational concepts and the five aspects of saluted Genesis, which are core theories that my research has shown contribute to that understanding of deliberate design for well being. And each of those aspects are also associated with one of the five feng shui elements. So I draw a card from each part of the deck. I talk about what those two cards mean as a pair. I'm going to only talk about a very narrow part of the topic as it relates to the two cards together. So you're going to learn more about it every time, but I won't flood you with information. I like to say I do all this research so you don't have to. Because if you can't use it or you don't understand it or it's too overwhelming, and none of us have that kind of time to waste. The card that I pulled from the foundational concepts part of the deck is the trauma card. And this card is black and murky on purpose because trauma is an emotional response. It's caused by severe, distressing events. It's stress 10x. And as you can see on this card, the darkness, the murkiness is about what we don't know, because what we don't know fuels our fears, fuels the triggers, puts our imagination on hyper overdrive. And some of the symbolism in the illustration that I developed for this card is the snake. That is all about transformation, healing, wisdom, temptation. But the snake is also something that's kind of scary. So it represents that unknown quantity. You can only see those red glowing eyes. And the black on the card symbolizes caution, fear, danger of the unknown, secretive truths, but also the ending of cycles and beginnings. So while trauma has many forms, today I want to talk specifically about post-traumatic stress disorder, otherwise known as PTSD, and what this has to do specifically with saluted Genesis. So, sense of coherence, one of the five aspects of saluted Genesis, and spoiler alert, is also the aspect under which the card that I drew in the companion card happens to be related to. Research has shown have a strong negative correlation. And what that means is if you have a weak sense of coherence, you tend to have a much stronger PTSD impact. And it's important to note that people can have trauma and not have PTSD. One does not always follow the other. And so, not only whether you will experience PTSD after a trauma, but also how severe it is, depends on the sense of coherence and how strong that is. So, weak sense of coherence, much higher likelihood of not only having PTSD, but having a much more severe impact. We are now living in fear, and there's that hypervigilance and danger that our body has now learned to associate with specific environmental cues. So let's say you were in a horrible car accident and the last thing you remember is headlights careening toward you. Well, now anytime you see headlights on the road, or even if you just experience bright lights coming at you in a different context, like maybe you're watching a movie or something like that, your brain automatically is saying, this isn't safe. Remember that accident. And it primes you to then experience all of the fear, all of the terror of the accident. I know my brother-in-law who served in the military and in some conflict situations can often struggle with loud noises. He has a hard time, say, going to the baseball game and hearing fireworks that get set off. He knows there are going to be fireworks, so it's not necessarily a surprise, but his body has still been primed to view that as a threat. So when we think about what we can do in design, we just need to be mindful of the population that we're designing for, because of course these threat triggers can be very different for different people, on what we can do to minimize that. And one of those ways, like I said, is related to sense of coherence. Sense of coherence is associated with the mental element, with the mind, with logic, with sensory processing and rationality. And sense of coherence is about how meaningful, manageable, and comprehensible our environment is. So it makes sense that there would be that connection, because when we experience a trauma, by definition, we didn't feel that the experience was something that we could manage. We experience it not just as a stressor, but as a true trauma. Now, the card that I drew happens to be scale cues. Now, you can see on this card that there is this repeating colonnade of arches. There's also this flagstone path that's taking us through this space. And there's some objects we can recognize, like the bicycle and the vases in the background, the repeating lanterns. Columns are a widely held belief, balance, strategy, the idea that there's options because we can move between them, we can move across them. The flagstones symbolize permanence, grounding, connection. The arches are about that idea that we're passing through something, that we have choices, meaning that we have control over the space. And the lights represent intelligence, truth, the illumination. Scale cues and how they relate to sense of coherence are the things in our environment that help us understand not only our relationship to the space. So, where are we in the space? Are we at one end of it? Are we in the middle of it? But also, how big is the space? Is it a small room, a large room? And this is really important because they help to have the inference and the perception of where we are, how to navigate. In ancient Egyptian architecture, especially in the late kingdom, there were things called hypostyle halls. And these were giant spaces that had forests of columns arranged in multiple rows. And these columns could be 4 feet wide and very, very tall. And the whole intent of this was, if you had an audience with the pharaoh, you had to walk down the center aisle of this giant hypostyle hall. You were completely dwarfed by this space, and these columns were covered in hieroglyphics that were telling the story of the power of Egypt, the power of the pharaoh. And the idea was that you felt very small, very insignificant, heading to somebody who was very important. And it was a psychological game that the pharaoh was playing with anyone who had an audience to try to establish a power balance. And you can see how that can start to impact how you would feel in the space. It's not unlike what a lot of institutional buildings will do, right? They try to set up this formality, this overscaling that makes you feel a little bit intimidated, a little bit like this is great power, great authority. And environmental cues are a big part of how we understand structure and predictability in our environment. So, this is why it's part of sense of coherence and why it particularly relates to PTSD. Because those who have PTSD often tend to have a processing advantage, it's called, to stimuli related to what caused their trauma. We all encounter thousands of stimuli every second, and our brain prioritizes it. So we're not consciously aware of a lot of what we're exposed to as we move through our day. So people with PTSD are hyper attuned to things that are triggers for their trauma because they've learned that that is a threat. So to try to reassure somebody, we want to think about having as many repeating elements as possible. When something repeats, it does two things. It, first of all, gives us a sense of predictability because we know what's happening next. But also, if something is repeating, that means that it is the same scale, the same size. And so, if we're close to one version of it, like say a column or a light fixture or an urn or something like that, and we know how big it is in relationship to us, and we see another one or more of those elements in the distance, we already understand a lot about the space and we know what to expect because we've encountered it before. Also, when there's familiar objects, things that we know the scale of, that can make a huge difference. And this is often done at theme parks where they will play with scale and oversize something that we think is a little bit smaller to make it seem like it's closer to us or further away from us. And this is done to manipulate our perception. You can see it in a lot of fun houses too, where the unpredictability is used to have a thrill or an impact. So, if we want to think, though, specifically about how to put these two cards together, how trauma and the sense of coherence concept of scale cues work together, we want to try to use objects that have a known scale to them in the space as much as possible. And we want a lot of repetition and therefore predictability in the space to make it easier to understand, more manageable. We also want to take the time to know who we're designing for so that there is true meaning that is positive infused into the space and things that could be triggering are minimized. So I hope that this information is helpful to you. And if it is, the best way to support getting more of this and support the channel is to like and subscribe. I love hearing from you. So if you have questions or thoughts, make sure that you leave a comment, and I will see you next time.